All right, we'll get started this morning. We're still hanging out in the book of Obadiah, but we are kind of still looking in Genesis. So if you want to mark your place in both of those, you can. But of course, 2 weeks ago, we kind of got started on this thought, the transcending vision of Obadiah. And obviously, the first week we talked a lot extensively about Obadiah, who coincidentally not a lot of information about him, and we learned what we could about not having any information about him. Um, and we learned how the significance of that is what allowed God to use him. Then last week we got into talking about one of the primary character of who Obadiah is writing to in Esau. Last week we talked about how, and we got kind of bogged down and talked extensively about how he was not a fan or cared too much about his birthright. We talked about all the different types of birthrights and stuff and the responsibilities that go along with that, and how, today we see that a lot of families today, those things, those traditions, those whatever you want to call it, have just kind of fallen away. It's usually after the whoever is the assumed patriarch of the family. Once that person kind of passes away and goes on, a lot of times the families, a close knit family can go through a time where they just kind of fall away. They break up. I mean, I can, speaking from personal experience about that, when my grandmother, my mom's mom, when she passed away, the family just kind of, even before then, the family was just kind of going in different directions. All of her kids got to be more wrapped up in what was going on with their family and lost the sight of the whole family. So much so that I ran into a cousin, well, his wife, my cousin, I run into his wife in a gas station in Seymour, and she had both of their kids with them, and they didn't even know who I was. They were young adults, they're already through college, never even met them. I knew my cousin Mike and Shelly, and I know Wes, and I can't think of his daughter's name right off the top of my head, but they'd never met me. They didn't even know who I was. I was a complete and total stranger to my own flesh and blood. That's kind of how things have gotten in today's society, and that's kind of the attitude and the direction that Esau had toward his birthright and towards the responsibilities of his family, to the point to where even there in let's see, what verse was it? Let me see. I'm trying to find it. In Genesis 25 and verse 23, it says, "And the Lord said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other." And that was Esau. He was the stronger of the two brethren, but the elder shall serve the younger. And it got to the point, I mean, God had this all planned out, and as we've said, and you've heard probably, multiple times if you've paid attention in different church services and stuff, and God doesn't need our help to do anything. God did not need Rebekah and Jacob's help to bring about what he had already told her here in verse number 23 in Genesis 25 about the fact that the younger, which would be Jacob, would be served by the elder. And they, through connivery and trickery and stuff like that, things played out the way they did. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today in the third person of our introduction here, to Obadiah is Jacob. The thought, it comes to mind, who is Jacob? Jacob, if you're a Bible scholar or heard or paid attention through Sunday school or in church services, Jacob was the younger son to Isaac and Rebekah. His twin was Esau, his paternal twin. But through Jacob comes the promise that God had made to his grandfather, Abraham. Jacob is who God chose, who God had handpicked, and was going to bring about the fact that his nation, he was going to set up his nation, Israel, through this third generation in a promise that he was going to fulfill in the person of Jacob. Jacob, as we know him today, was through his lineage is where the 12 tribes of Israel descended from. He had 12 sons, and probably the most familiar of those sons would be Joseph. As we know, it was through Joseph that God allowed things to transpire throughout his life to bring about the survival of his people. His brothers, his sisters, his brothers, his family, and everything else. It was through the things that had transpired and taken place in Joseph's life, which was right or wrong, was the favorite son of Jacob. Now, we see that this is not just something that only happened in Jacob's life with his sons, but this is something that he had to experience and see firsthand in his upbringing. If you look at, let's see, where we at here? This did not print out the way that I have it in my iPad, and I can't find what I'm looking for in my notes here. But anyway, there was a time down here, verse number 28, Genesis 25 and 28. It says, "And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob." And that verse tells us that Isaac had his favorite, and he chose Esau. His wife Rebekah had more of a parental love towards Jacob. And a lot of times, my two back here, they always carry on about who they think is my favorite. And of course, Brady says me, Destiny says Brady, but I love them both equally. Now, the thing is in that me and Brady are always going to have a little bit closer bond because we're both male. We both have the similar interest. But I know, right? But I still love my daughter because she's my only daughter. She unfortunately has a lot of me in her, and and everything else, and we bicker and fuss and gripe with each other and everything, wrestle around, tussle and stuff. But I love both of my kids equally. But yet here in what's so funny, Destiny? Okay, but see here in this passage of Scripture, we see that Jacob recognized early on who the parental favorites were. Like we said, Isaac was more drawn to Esau because probably Esau probably took more after his dad. He was probably more of an outdoorsman. As we see here in verse number 28 in Genesis 25, he's talking about, the Bible's telling us that Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison. Now, as we know from last week, that Esau was an outdoorsman. He did a lot of things outdoor. Um, he was a hunter, a cunning hunter, as the Bible tells us. Back up in verse number 27, that Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. So, as we see here, we have where Esau and Isaac were kind of like two peas in a pod. They both had a lot of the same similar interests. Esau probably took more after Isaac, where Jacob was more. I hate to use the term, but it's a term that we're all very familiar with. Was more of a what society would call a mama's boy. He stayed around mom. He had more of a love for his mother, and he loved his dad. Obviously, I'm 100% sure of that. He did love his dad and everything else, but he stayed in and took more after his mother, and they were closer. And as we'll come to see, through that parental, what was the word I used over here? Parental approval, that is as old as time. We see where Isaac identified more with Esau and Rebekah identified more with Jacob, and they kind of took after each other. But yet, at the same time, when we understand more about Jacob, now the thing about Jacob was Rebekah was his promised wife from his soon-to-be father-in-law. Jacob, after everything transpired with Jacob, and the thing that we know, the most familiar thing we know about Jacob was that even though God had told Rebekah, the mother, that the younger would serve, or the older would serve the younger, God had it planned out. God was going to bring about this thing in his time, yet Rebekah didn't want to wait. Rebekah wanted to see Jacob become the next leader of the family. Jacob had more of that heart, where Esau had more of a heart for things outside of God. Esau didn't really see the necessity or have the love to follow after God the way that Jacob did. And as we see, and that's going to come out more as we look into the things that's going to be happening in the book of Obadiah. But Jacob, his mother, when Esau was out on a hunting trip and stuff, Isaac had gotten to the point to where he was getting blind and everything else, and he really communicated more through touch and feel. So much so that the way Rebekah could fix the venison, what Esau would go out and hunt and fix and bring in and give to his dad, she got to the point where she could do that and mimic it just the way that Esau could fix it. And one time while Esau was away, she goes to Jacob, and this is where the cunning part of Jacob comes in. She comes in and causes and tells Jacob to do as she says, and she sends him in to steal the birthright from Isaac. Now, the way that would work is that at a certain time in what we call the patriarch, or the leader of the family, when they would get to that point in this, back in the Bible days and the Old Testament days, when they would get to a certain point in life before they died, they would go ahead and give that birthright to the oldest son. And they would step in and assume their position in the family, and that's where the responsibilities from the dad would be transitioned over to that would now become the responsibilities of the oldest son. They would have to step into the place of that spiritual leader, of that leader just in general of the family. They would step into that role and continue on, and they would be the ones that would be responsible for keeping the family together and keeping the spirituality of that family and keeping it moving. Now that's important because, as we know, the two different people, we have Esau over here, as we talked about last week. He was more of an outdoorsman. He was one that did not see the value in having birthright. He didn't see the value in having that responsibility of being the spiritual leader of the family. He was not what you would typically call a spiritual individual anyway. Jacob, on the other hand, was. And that's why God had it planned out to where in his time, he was going to bring Jacob in, and Jacob would assume that responsibility. Yet, through the cunningness and the conniving of Jacob and his mother Rebekah, they tricked Isaac into giving the birthright that God was going to give him anyway. He had done told her, this is how it's going to be. The birthright is this, but the older is going to serve the younger. God was going to bring about in his time. We don't know how, it doesn't ever say, but we don't know how God had it planned out. All we do know is that God had told her, Jacob is going to he's going to get the birthright. We don't know how God was going to bring all that about. But yet at the same time, they took it upon themselves. Now Jacob, he protested. He did not really feel comfortable in doing this, but yet he listened to his mother, did what you would call the right thing to do as far as a child listening to their parent, even though the parent's in the wrong. The child still listened. He did as he was instructed and did as his mother told him, and he killed a lamb and took the skin off and put it on the parts that his dad, that Isaac would touch to see, because as the Bible tells us, Esau was a hairy individual. I don't know how hairy. We just know that he had an exorbitant amount of hair on his hands. Most of us have finite little hairs in their fingers, on their fingers and so forth. I don't know. I don't know if his was just like, Brady's head of hair back there on his knuckles. I don't know. On his hands. All we do know is that he was a very hairy individual, and Jacob wasn't. Jacob was more of your typical individual, not as hairy, and that was one of the things that Isaac would check to see. He did notice that they don't sound alike. And in the Bible and in this account in Genesis, it tells us that, Isaac was, kind of confused about the fact that here this man, he says, you sound like, in his mind he's saying, you sound like Jacob, but yet you feel like Esau. And anyway, and then he wanted to eat his venison. So Jacob brings in the venison that his mother had fixed the way Esau did his brother and give it to him. And that was one of the things that helped convince Isaac that he was dealing with Esau, and he gave that birthright of the family to Jacob. Now, when Esau found out about it, he got mad. But yet he had also, in the same passage of Scripture, traded the birthright for, as Brother Chris said over Wednesday night, he traded for for just a bowl of soup. Jacob, as being the quote-unquote mama's boy, he could fix food the way, evidently he was, a good cook. I don't know. But yet, one time when Esau's out hunting and he comes in and he's he's famished, he's extremely hungry, and everything else. He comes in and asks Jacob for a bowl of his pottage, bowl of soup, and Jacob says, "For the soup, I'll give you this for in return for the birthright of the family." And Esau said, "What is it to me?" Because he did not care about that. That was not at the top of his priority list. He could care less about it. So he said, "What is it to me if I'm fixing to die anyway?" And he wasn't. You know how you get when you get really, really hungry. I mean, you see the Snickers commercials on TV where they're hangry, and they tell you, you're not you, and they give somebody a Snickers, and they take one bite, and then they turn back from a little old lady that's complaining about everything into a middle-aged individual man, and they're like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I'm good now."
My favorite one is William Dafoe turning into Marilyn Monroe. That commercial is so funny.
But like I said, that's kind of how that's we get in that position. A lot of times our bodies will tell us, "Hey, we'll get to the point to where we just like over exaggerate things." And that's what Esau had done. Esau was over exaggerating his hunger and just flippantly said, "Yeah, sure, you can have the birthright." But yet at the same time, it was something that Esau wanted. Esau wanted the birthright because of the benefits that came with it, not the responsibilities that came with it. And so therefore that was the only primary reason that Esau wanted it, because he would get, the majority of the possessions of the family and all that. And that's all he was interested in. He wasn't interested in the spiritual responsibility of that position. And Jacob was. And that's why God had put that in Jacob, and that's why God was going to bring Jacob into the position that he was going to bring him, so that he could take him out and then through him, fulfill the promise that he had made to Abraham, his grandfather. So as we see in all of that, we see the fact that he was a conniving individual. Now, as we see, and we kind of got off into that, but when Jacob, through the things that he had done with stealing the birthright, he had to flee, because once Esau came in to get the birthright, and Isaac realized he had given the birthright to Jacob, Esau got mad. Esau was ready. He was wanting to find Jacob and kill him and take the birthright back and everything else, because like I said, it wasn't for the spiritual part, as we'll soon see. It was because he wanted the possessions that came along with that. And Jacob I don't think he was all that interested in that part. He was more interested in the spiritual aspect of the responsibility of the family. And Jacob flees. Now, because of the things that had happened with stealing that birthright, he gets over to his grandfather, to his father-in-law, Laban, and through Laban, he winds up falling in love with Rebekah, but Laban tricks him into serving him. Because back then you would have to put up a dowry. Is that what they would call it? Dowry. They would have to put up that to ask another man for his daughter's hand in marriage and everything else. Jacob didn't have anything. So he went to Laban and worked for him for, 7 years, something like that. And in return, he was going to get Rebekah. Well, Laban tricked him. Laban gave him, I think her name was Leah. I think it's what her older sister was. And then when Jacob realized that he had been tricked, he gets mad and comes back to his father-in-law, and his father-in-law, I can't, marry off my youngest without my oldest being married first. So Jacob still loved Rebekah, and to the point to where he worked another 7 years for his father, for his father-in-law, for Rebekah's hand in marriage. And that's why you see, as we seen back over when we was talking about Esau, why Jacob loved Rebekah. Now, Leah had given him more sons than Rebekah did, but he loved Rebekah, and that's why he went to God and asked God to give her son. And because another reason that Joseph was one of his favorites was because it was the firstborn son of Rebekah, and then she also birthed him Benjamin. That was the two, I think, that she bore him, and the other 10 came from Leah, his other wife. Now, as we see, because of all of that, the things in the lesson to learn in that is the things that we do will come back to haunt you. Today's society would call that karma. In reality, the Bible says that we will reap what we sow. And that's what the cunning, the dishonesty, and the things that Jacob did to get to where he was with the birthright came back, and God returned that cunningness, that underhandedness back to him in the 2 wives that he had now with that he had took from Laban. I did not take, but that was the he really wanted. He had a lot more love and affection for Rebekah, and that's who he really originally wanted, but Laban tricked him. So as we see, what the Bible tells us is that what we reap, we will sow. Sometimes it may not come back in our lifetime like Jacob. It came back just a few years after he had tricked his father for the birthright, which God was going to give him anyway. It's just the fact that Jacob, especially Rebekah, his mother, was not willing to wait on God's timing. And a lot of times that's what gets us in the biggest trouble in our life is a lot of times we're not willing to wait on God to bring about what he has promised or what he's put in our heart to do. There is a thing of getting out in front of God. You can do that. You can, and a lot of people have done that, and it usually doesn't end well. It doesn't mean God can't take that and turn it around and use it eventually, but it's going to wind up putting us down a lot longer and harder road than we would have had to go down if we'd have just waited on God. If Jacob had waited on God for that birthright that he had told Rebekah was going to come his way, his mother, then I don't know how Jacob's life would have turned out. That's the thing. You don't know what God could have done. You don't know how things could have gone. All you know is what we've actually had to experience. That's what we have in Genesis. We have what actually happened. We don't have what could have happened. We don't have an account. Well, if Jacob hadn't have done X, then Y and Z would have happened and everything would have come out. We don't have that. All we know is X caused this to happen, which caused this to happen, which now brought everything back here. But like I said, that's just kind of how things a lot of times work out when we don't wait on God. And that's an important thing. So as we see here, in this introduction, what we've looked at, and I know this has kind of been a little bit maybe weird as far as a 3-part introduction into this, but it's going to pay off in the long run because when we get to looking into it, like we said, the Old Testament is full of typologies. It's full of pictures. It's full of things that are given to us for our benefit. Now, what would be the benefit of understanding who Obadiah is, who Esau is, and who Jacob is? As we know, Jacob, when he was coming back home after he's coming back home after, serving his time away for his two wives and starting his family and everything else. He's now coming back home, and he gets word that Esau's still looking for him. And then he gets into the wrestling match one night with God, and to get away, the Christophany touches his hip, dislocates his hip to some extent to where he has a predominant limp. And if you know the Bible, you know that story. He's coming back in, and it's at that particular time that God changes his name from Jacob to Israel. And that's where the nation of Israel gets their name, is through Jacob. It is God's chosen people, and we know that. We've heard that time and time again, over and over and over again, that Israel is God's chosen people. That's where they get the name, as we talked about. It's through the 12 sons of Jacob that the nation of Israel progressed. It grew from those 12 sons. And that's where they get their name, is from their father, their grandfather, Jacob. Jacob is where the Israelites, the Jews, get their national identity. Now, what is so important about Esau? Esau would be a picture of two people. It could be a typology of the spirit that has no need for God, the individual who, I can do things on my own, I don't need God in my life, and everything else, and they have the attitude that God's a myth, God's this, God's that, and they don't see the importance of following and having God in their life. But not only that, but as we know, Esau was also born into what we know as a nation, as the Bible told us, that two nations were going to come out of Rebekah's womb. One was the nation of Israel. The other was the nation of Edom. And Esau was the father of Edom. Now, that's who the book of Obadiah is written to, is to Esau and the nation of Edom. And that's kind of what we're going to be getting into. Now, Esau is a picture of, like I said, the individual who has no need for God, but it's also a picture and a typology of the nation. A nation that has no need, or sees no need, or has any desire to follow after the things of God. That's going to come into importance as we progress in this study, because we can see one very close nation that we live in that could identify with Edom. But Obadiah, who would Obadiah be? And we know Israel is Jacob. Esau is a nation, Edom, a nation that's prideful, that has no need for God. It could also, illustrate the individual who has no need for God. But Obadiah, and this is kind of where I was trying to figure out, where does Obadiah fit into all this? Obadiah, in my opinion, and you if you have a different opinion, that's fine. But in my opinion, Obadiah is the writer of Obadiah, as we know. But Obadiah was the one that God chose to give a message, a vision to the world. We as the church are that same messenger. We're a bunch of people that just kind of blend in with everybody, but yet we have a cause. We have something that's given to us to proclaim to the world, just as Obadiah did. So as we see, Obadiah is a type, in my opinion, is a typology of the church. Esau is the nation that has no need for God. And as we know, Israel is God's chosen people and God's chosen nation. And all three of these are going to come into importance and come out and be borne out as we study and continue on through the book of Obadiah. All right. The third, that's it. Thank you.